episode on Joe. It's a
It's not $300. I know that
separate.
goddamn much.
Yeah, and honestly, it should be way more. You know what I mean? Like I know what I do and who I am. You know what I mean? Late and all. As sick as it sounds, it is important to me. A guy reached out to me the other day. We were talking about on Joe podcast. He reached out to me the other day. I did my research on you. I got a lot of respect for you. None of the street, they all stop talking to them about this street. And it's like I ain't hear nothing but did my research. I respect you. I'm like, yeah.
Mona, also known as Don't Call Me White Girl, recently came out in an interview claiming that Joe Budden is underpaying her. And that statement raised a lot of eyebrows for one very specific reason. Her performance on the show has not exactly been at its peak lately. She has shown up late on multiple occasions. She often comes across as underprepared, and by most accounts, she has struggled to find her footing within the existing dynamic of the cast. Now, she does appear to be pulling in views from time to time, so there is some value there that cannot be completely dismissed. But the overall picture of how she is fitting into the show is not a particularly strong one. And when you factor in the behind-the-scenes conversations that have reportedly been happening, the full story becomes even more complicated than what is visible on the surface. The first time this situation came across the radar was through a video put out by Chatterbox, who broke down in detail how Mona has not been operating as a team player. According to that video, there are conversations happening behind closed doors, private meetings between Mona and Joe where he is essentially pulling her aside and asking her directly to explain certain choices and patterns of behavior. That video included a clip from a recent interview where Mona stated plainly that she deserves significantly more money and that her tardiness should have absolutely no bearing on that number whatsoever. And honestly, that framing raises a genuine question that deserves a real answer. Where exactly is that level of confidence coming from? Because anyone who has spent real time observing the Joe Budden podcast understands that the engine driving that entire platform is Joe Budden himself. The show's reach, its audience, its ability to attract major guests and generate consistent attention, all of that flows from him first and foremost. Individual cast members contribute in their own ways, and some contribute more meaningfully than others, but the foundation of the show belongs entirely to Joe. So for Mona to position herself as someone who is being financially shortchanged suggests she may have developed a distorted understanding of how the value on that show is actually distributed and who is responsible for generating it. What this situation really points to when you step back and look at the full picture is that Mona might be carrying some genuine frustration, and it may not even be frustration directed at Joe personally. It could be frustration with the fan base, with the environment, with the expectations placed on her, or simply with how difficult it has been to carve out a lane for herself on a show that already had a very established identity long before she arrived. She has made a noticeable habit of taking shots at the audience, and that is not the kind of thing that goes unnoticed or unchallenged inside a professional organization. From what is understood about how the Joe Budden podcast operates contractually, there are specific expectations around how cast members are permitted to speak about the fan base in public settings. Dismissing the JBTV community, calling them out, or insulting them in any capacity is not something the show tolerates lightly, and there are real professional consequences attached to crossing that line. That is not a rumor. It is reportedly written into the agreements that govern how cast members represent the show publicly. Now here is what makes this whole situation particularly ironic when you zoom out and look at it objectively. Despite all of the complaints about how difficult and exhausting it is to work on the Joe Budden podcast, and Mona is far from the only one who has voiced those kinds of frustrations, because Flip and Ice have made similar comments at various points throughout their time on the show, not a single one of them is actually walking out the door. Nobody is leaving, and that silence speaks volumes. The most straightforward explanation is not blind loyalty or a lack of options. It's the platform value that comes directly attached to being associated with that show. Being a cast member on the Joe Budden podcast opens professional doors, creates business opportunities, and commands rates in outside markets that would simply not be accessible otherwise. That reality applies directly and specifically to Mona. The rates she is reportedly able to charge for outside interviews and appearances exist in large part because of the credibility, visibility, and name recognition that the Joe Budden podcast has given her. Without that platform, those numbers do not exist in the same way, and that's a fact worth sitting with before making public statements about being underpaid. And to add one more layer to all of this that really puts things in perspective, Mona arrived 2.5 hours late to her own interview. Not 15 minutes, not 30 minutes, 2.5 hours late to a sit-down conversation where someone carved out time specifically to speak with her. So for someone operating with that level of regard for other people's time and professional commitments to then turn around and publicly argue that she deserves to be compensated at a higher rate is a position that is genuinely very difficult to defend by any reasonable standard. There is also a broader principle worth addressing here because it applies well beyond just this situation. Yes, anyone technically has the right to ask for more money. That's not being disputed. But that request needs to be grounded in something real and tangible. It needs to be supported by consistent performance, by metrics that actually justify the ask, and by a professional track record that gives the other party a reason to say yes. Showing up late on a regular basis, appearing underprepared for discussions, and failing to bring measurable audience numbers that would demand a higher rate is simply not a foundation from which anyone can negotiate credibly. Now, the exact figure of what Mona earns per episode is not public knowledge, but the specific way she phrased her complaint, referencing how much she makes per pod, is actually very telling. If she's on a per-episode payment structure, which that phrasing strongly implies, then every single time she misses a recording or shows up too late to contribute in any meaningful way, that's money she's forfeiting on her own. The compensation structure itself may already be built to reflect exactly the kind of inconsistency she's been displaying. And when you frame her pay complaint within that context, it lands in a completely different way than she likely intended it to.
What makes this situation even more significant is that her contract was apparently restructured not long ago in a way that reduced her role and her obligations. According to what has come out publicly, Mona is no longer a required presence for Patreon recordings. If she shows up for that content at all, it is essentially being offered as a courtesy rather than as a contractual requirement. She went from being a regular fixture on the pod multiple times per week to being quietly scaled back, and her absence from the Patreon content has now become the expected norm rather than the exception. That kind of shift does not happen randomly or without intention. When someone's presence on a show starts getting quietly reduced, fewer episodes, removed from premium content, less screen time overall, that is almost always the first visible sign that the organization has begun moving in a different direction and is creating space to eventually move on entirely. She may be picking up occasional appearances on the JBP Rewind as a way to keep some income flowing and balance things out financially, but the overall trajectory of where things are heading is not difficult to read. And here is what really stands out when you look at the full picture of Mona's situation. She appears to be watching what the people around her are earning, measuring her own compensation against those numbers, and feeling like she is being left behind financially, which is an interesting stance for someone who comes from a culture that speaks very loudly and very often about the problems with watching other people's pockets. But in fairness, that is an extremely human tendency. Most people, regardless of background or beliefs, find themselves doing exactly that at some point. The difference is that most people handle it privately rather than broadcasting it on someone else's platform. There is also the matter of the Lipo 360 procedure that recently surfaced on social media when a doctor posted about it publicly and tagged her in the content. The way those kinds of arrangements typically work in influencer and media circles is straightforward. The doctor provides a discounted or entirely complimentary procedure in exchange for promotional visibility through the patient's platform and audience, which means it was specifically the Joe Budden podcast platform and the audience she has built as a result of being on it that made that kind of opportunity available to her in the first place. Add to that the fact that she has spoken openly and on the record during actual episodes of the show about securing a new apartment directly as a result of the income and opportunities generated by being a cast member, and the picture that emerges becomes very clear. The show has tangibly and meaningfully improved her quality of life in multiple concrete ways. New living situation, cosmetic procedures covered through promotional arrangements, interview rates that reflect her association with a major podcast, all of that traces back to the Joe Budden podcast.
And yet, rather than take